Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us. I have quite an important question to ask first. Do you like my shirt? Representing the queer community in South Africa's Pink City. Thank you. But on a serious note, we are about to talk about coalitions. I am a novice, as many of you are. Coalitions are quite new to South Africa's political body. The turning point was in 2016 when the results of the local government elections and a bunch of parties had to come together to form a government, I guess. The ANC's dominance, as we know, is reducing. And my reference point is that I'm from Johannesburg. We've had so many mayors, more than 5, I think, in a few years. Many motions of no confidences have been brought, against mayors. Service delivery has also been compromised in the process. But I still love Joburg, despite Capetonians just trashing it, mostly. But I want to level set and start with our panelists, and maybe start with William and work our way towards the panel members. Do you believe coalitions are good or bad? Do you support them? What say you?
No, thank you. I'm so happy to be here and very excited. It's very exciting. I mean, it's very good energy when I walked into the room. I think to start off with, just to say that since 1945 in Africa, so through a post-colonial period, the most successful form of governance, the model of governance is, any suggestions? Military rule? No. Liberation movements? It's actually coalition governance. It's been the most successful model. If you think about it, 54 African countries, according to the UN, and many of those countries have failed. So the most successful ones, whether it's Mauritius, whether it's Cape Verde, and so on, has been coalitions. Yeah. So that's just, I want to make a case for coalitions. Secondly, coalitions actually works better in countries like our country, very diverse countries that come from conflict, from war. I mean, if you look at Japan after the Second World War, if you look at Germany after the Second World War, and it also works very well when parties want to get out really entrenched corrupt parties like military rule, liberation movements and so on. So in Brazil, just imagine in Brazil, since the late 1950s, it has been continuously coalitions. So all of the growth miracle of Brazil has been based on coalitions. So I think there really is an argument against coalitions. There's about 40 plus coalitions in the world right now, and coalitions in the developing countries and in the developed countries has brought, in the post-war period, 1945, certainly, the growth miracles.
So in support of coalitions, right? Okay. All right. Jordan?
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very much in favor of majority governments if they can be achieved. If they can be achieved, of course. And I'm very, very grateful to have a majority government in the city of Cape Town. But when they cannot be achieved, as I think we will have in this upcoming election on the 29th of May, and that's quite an extraordinary thing, actually, Ray, that I think we gloss over, but the idea that this party that has for 30 years completely dominated every election, and in which the only question has ever been what is going to be the size of their majority, that is over. When that is not possible, then obviously one has to enter the era of coalitions, and then really the question becomes how to make those coalitions stable and productive and successful and deliver some of the results that the professor has spoken about. And I have some thoughts on that. And in our context currently, I must say, obviously, a coalition would be better than the current national majority government. That would absolutely be better for South Africa's future. And so I hope that that does happen.
Okay, so 2 supports so far. Lindiwe?
Yeah, context matters. I don't have an absolute view on one or the other. A majority government or a coalition government is as good as the political parties that it comprises. Full stop. So you can have a majority. There are many municipalities in this country that are only governed by one political party, that are under administration by Treasury. So the notion that a majority gives stability, good governance, no. A majority or a coalition is only as good as the players. And one party can govern and destroy a municipality or a province or a country. And likewise, multiple parties can do the same. And I think I'm excited about the era of coalition government at provincial and national level for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's a reflection of what people want. And ultimately, that's what elections are supposed to be, not a reflection of what politicians and political parties want, but a reflection of voters' aspirations. And by not giving power to one single behemoth, voters are saying, we don't trust any of you enough to govern alone, so learn how to govern together. So I think all the challenges you and I know a lot about in the city of Johannesburg are the teething that is going to precede the time when we get to see a coalition government that is functional, that is effective. But as much, I think, as large political parties may want to wish coalitions away, that ship has sailed. It's really only a question of, can we pull together governments and partnerships that are based on policies, principles, and values, not jobs, positions, offices, and so forth. But that depends on the political parties that form part of the pact.
And we'll explore about how coalitions should work for people, because some politicians have really behaved like pubescent teenagers. We'll get to that shortly.
Yeah, so I don't know if I can disagree with anyone, so I'll say 2 quick points so we can kind of keep it moving. So in favor of coalitions, but I've got a problem with political parties. So MISTRA released a really good report last year around coalitions, where they showed us that coalitions in South Africa is not new. There are dozens of municipalities in this country over the last 20 years that have been governed in coalitions. So the question then becomes, what is going on with coalitions at a metro level? When you look at metros become like this battleground of political discourse, of influence in the country, that if a political party can unseat the ANC at a metro level, it is a sign that you can unseat them at a national level. And it creates a particular political culture that I think is not congruent with coalitions. And Lindy was kind of mentioning there about this teething aspect in Joburg. I think it was teething. I think it's now showing us what the norm could be. And the issue is, if the political culture of political parties is winner takes all, not about power sharing, the logic of a political party is simply winner takes all, the crisis that we see in Joburg will happen everywhere else. The crisis in Joburg is not because people don't know how to govern with each other. The crisis is that someone wants to be the leader, really, at all stakes, to the point that will give a party that has 3 people at a municipal level representation, becoming the mayor of one of the biggest metros on the continent. That is a power game. That's not in the benefit of citizens, that's not in the benefit of the everyday South African, but political parties accept that. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what should change? The legislation, political parties will be like, well, if you increase the threshold, then we can get rid of smaller parties and, we can balance out the numbers and maybe we can create some sort of stability at a local level. I think that won't solve it. So long as political parties are not behaving in a manner where they accept that power sharing is the norm, that we negotiate, that we compromise, that becomes your political values, then we'll continuously have a crisis on our hands, and the teething problems will become a normal issue in our discourse. And I think that's the challenge that we face now.
Yeah,
So Rekhotsofetse has talked about the MISTRA findings, a marriage of inconvenience, which I think is very real, very relevant to this whole conversation. And I just looked through it earlier, and it's quite daunting what kind of things need to be done for coalitions to work. So I suppose my question is, do we have time to implement, if, say, we are going to have a coalition, and we can start with you here. Do we have time? I mean, the history of coalitions in this country have not been good. I don't think the public are looking at it thinking, wow, we've got great examples. And so what is the one thing you think that needs to be done, implemented, so that politicians and parties can start talking about cooperation and meaningful governance as opposed to what this show that we've been seeing to date?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should I go?
Sure.
So I work, my day job is like the School of Governance, and I've been having a debate with a colleague of mine about proportional representation in our country and whether we should have a closed list, 100% proportional representation, which, by the way, is a crazy system. Right? It's a really crazy, it was a remnant of 1994 that we needed at the time. 30 years onwards, we're seeing the cracks of having such a system. So we don't have time to make two changes. Right? We're completely in the hands of political parties. So over the next 5 years, if we really want the logic of coalitions to function in the current context of South Africa, our time is electoral reform, constituency-based system. We can fight on that another day. Right? That is the long-term change that can happen. In the short term, again, we're in the hands of political parties and the benevolence of their heart. So I'm hoping they feel really good about this. But it is this minimum threshold. Without having a minimum threshold about who can come in, we will have a crisis because of the nature of our political situation, that there's so many voices. But having so many voices doesn't mean that all those voices have to be on the table. Again, that is a remnant of the 1994 agreement, to make sure that every single voice is represented. We've now gone 30 years, and the question is, do we still need that model? Now, that's a loaded question, right? It has real repercussions to it about what representation means in 2024 in particular. But I think those two changes can happen, but we don't have enough time to do it for this election, so hopefully for 2029, if things shake up, we can do it then.
I absolutely loathe this threshold discussion. It makes me sick to my stomach. Many of the big parties, or actually one of the big parties, as Jordan knows, today started with 7 MPs in Parliament. If there were a threshold in 94, it wouldn't exist today. So there's this thing of after me, the revolution can happen. I've grown big enough not to need a threshold. Now, all the new political parties must be blocked from ever having a chance to grow in the same way that I was able to grow.
And where you are referring to the DA.
I'm referring to the DA, sorry. I didn't mean to be mysterious. But the DA had 7 MPs after the first elections, right? So it grew. Political parties need room and space and time to grow. That's a legitimate thing. But this thing about thresholds problematizes not the majority parties. It problematizes the startups, the small parties. And it finds ways to hobble them, to gatekeep them, to prevent them from going through the necessary growth that can, if they have leaders of integrity, a growing support base, etc., get them representation in Parliament, get them a voice for the people who did vote for them, and give them an opportunity to one day form the future of government. We've just spoken about how the problem is the political parties that we currently have. So what are we trying to strangle the birth of new political parties for, if that is the problem? Why are we doubling down on the very thing that we think is the problem at hand? Just because the alternatives need time, they need space, they're never going to come in at 51%. And in fact, a PR system is never going to produce a majority party in this country, I think, ever again. I think those days are over. The system doesn't work that way. When every single vote counts and every single vote is counted, that doesn't produce a majoritarian system. So if we recognize that the guys right now who are sitting around the coalition negotiation table are screwing it up, why is the answer, let's prevent anybody else from offering an alternative?
Perhaps Jordan, as a representative of the DA, can tell us, and your view as well. I mean, they've called, among other things, the DA, I think, called for an ombud to manage and oversee coalitions, which is an interesting concept. But if you could just maybe respond with Lindiwe as well.
So, two things. I think it is really wonderful for South Africa's future that no political party will ever dominate a national election ever again. And I think that is true, and that is absolutely unmistakably positive for our future, and very, very exciting. I do think the points that Lindiwe have made are certainly compelling, but to a certain extent it is moot because the Constitutional Court has in fact already imposed something of a threshold. It's a strange kind of threshold, but it is a threshold. If you can't get more than, or if you can't even get 100,000 signatures, you can't even get onto the national ballot. Now, there were something like 360-something parties that registered to be on the national ballot in 2024. We don't yet know how many have actually crossed that 100,000 signature threshold requirement to make it onto the national ballot.
17,000.
No, 17,000 in each province. Each province, yeah. So I suspect that we will see many, many fewer parties actually getting onto the national ballot when the list is released in a few weeks' time. And so that is a kind of threshold in and of itself. But I do think even going back to 1994, where the DA got 1.7% of the vote, as Lindiwe says, and has grown into 20-odd%. To have a reasonable, really small threshold of, say, 0.5%. I will use the example of the city of Cape Town, where we have got 18 political parties represented in the council. If we had a 1% threshold, that number would drop to 10. So there's 8 political parties that got less than 1% of the vote and yet are represented in the council. They have an opportunity to speak on every matter, and if it were a coalition scenario, thank goodness it is not, they may all be the kingmakers, each one of them, delivering a result where a party that got 3,000 votes out of 2 million in Johannesburg ends up being the mayor. So I do think it is reasonable we have a de facto threshold now from the Constitutional Court, and it would be reasonable to have, I think, a very small electoral threshold that suggests if you can't even get enough support to get 1%, then perhaps you can't be at the coalition table. And I think that would be perfectly healthy.
Great, thanks.
I have to start to say that actually most of the coalitions are actually working, except the big metros. So the majority of coalitions are working. So I don't have a very negative view of coalition. But let me talk from another hat that I have. 28th to 29th of February, I co-chaired the South African Local Government Association's dialogue to try to find a legal framework for coalition that can be turned into law. And we looked at different permeations. One of the permeations is the threshold, but the threshold, to have a minimum threshold around the world has been reviewed. I mean, there's a couple of countries that have minimum thresholds, like Turkey and so on. It hasn't been working very well, and there's so across the world where countries that have this sort of minimum threshold, they are reviewing it. And in our context, it is very likely to be unconstitutional because the way our constitution is written in a way for party representation. And so on. So it would immediately, I would foresee a constitutional challenge if we're in that space. What I would rather suggest, and what I have suggested as part of this framework that we have sent on to government, and hopefully it's going to be discussed, it's too late now for this parliamentary session. It's too late. I mean, it was only organized on the 28th, 29th February, so that's is the government. It's taken such a long time with this. But I think for the next parliament, it's very likely to discuss it. And we have to think about the potential of having a minority government. So the idea that where no party gets a majority, but the party with the biggest majority to give their party a chance to form a government. For example, I mean, that is in Sweden, it's the case, it's in Canada, it's the case, so that, for us to look at that way. But I think the important thing is, I mean, why do coalitions fail? And the first thing is maturity of leaders. Now, do we have the maturity of political leaders? That's the first. What do I mean by maturity? I mean, we don't have a grown-up leaders. We have grown-up, but they're not grown up. Yeah. I mean, the idea that if you elected...
William, can I just, on that thought, sorry, because we do have to move quite quickly, but on that thought, you as the convener of the MPC, you can describe if, that's what your description must be of. You tell us, what's it like to convene 8 parties? My colleague, who is now as the stand-up comic, but actually a journalist, Rebecca Davis, she actually asked you in November last year, how do you get 8 men possessing sizable political egos to put aside their individual interests and come together for the greater good? So how has it been, bearing in mind, you do need this level of maturity? Is it working?
Can I add as well, are they willing to embrace compromises and set aside their own differences in the spirit of service delivery, I guess?
It's like herding cats.
And is it true?
No, I haven't said that. Yeah.
Name them, please. Name them. It's difficult.
Apparently you resort to hugging.
I mean, they're all grown up. They're all compromised. I threatened them. Well, what you want out? That Freedom Front Plus leaders, if you don't compromise, you are going to dance in front of everyone on the tune of Amapiano. No, I didn't say that, but like something similar, and so on. I'm actually very encouraged. I mean, with a group. I'm independent. I was an independent negotiator, independent chair of trying to bring them together, and I'm still trying to get some of the other parties that's not part of it that have constitutional values, to come to join. I personally think that our coming elections this election is such a critical election. It's not going to be an election about. There's going to be one of standalone parties. This is not a standalone party election. I mean, this is, I think historically in our country, there's going to be an election of coalitions versus the ANC. And I think once the momentum of the campaign begins, because we're not in the heart of the election campaign now, but very soon, I mean, the next few days, a few weeks, we'll get into the campaign. I think we're going to see if it's going to be a coalition of the MPC, and then there's going to be a coalition, MK, Umkhonto Zuma's party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and Ace Magasule's African Transformation Congress, under correction, and other kinds of parties. Yeah. So we're going to have the coalitions versus the ANC. And I think smaller parties, in my conversation with some of the smaller parties, obviously, when I say sort of smaller parties, there's parties with some kind of constitutional values, because that's the whole point of creating a pre-electoral charter and a coalition is to get parties that adhere to the Constitution, that are rational and are populist, to bring them together. So I fear that the smaller parties, whether they are pop-up parties or whether they are a little bit more organized, that they're going to fall by the wayside as we go into the elections.
Jordan, Lindiwe and Rakhosofense, I often feel like, especially in Johannesburg, I feel like a bystander to party politics when motions of no confidences are brought and there is a leadership instability. It happens in Nelson Mandela Bay, it happens in Tshwane. For the people in the room and those watching, what power or powers do they have in making coalitions work and holding these adults accountable and to center us as well when it comes to politics and service delivery? So I'd love each of you very quickly to have a stab at it.
You want me to go?
Yeah.
So, again, I want to say I'm very fortunate not to have a coalition, but I work with those tiny parties, many of them who are in those coalitions, and I see, I saw how badly treated the opposition was in Parliament. So I have regular meetings with all the leaders of the opposition in Cape Town and let them air their views. And I say this as a generalization. It's not true of every smaller party, but as a generalization, there is very little principle, very little policy, very little vision for the country or the city. It is all about what we can get out of it, what is the next best deal that we can get. And that is, again, a generalization, but it's certainly something that I've seen to be true in my interaction with them. So it's not helpful to empower those parties. I think Johnny Steinberg made this argument brilliantly in his piece in the Sunday Times. Very powerful piece, which I encourage you to read. That the support for these very, very small parties, again, I'm not talking about those startups that have a genuine vision for the country and a genuine contribution and space to carve out in the electoral map, but those kind of gimme parties, let's call them that, voters have the choice not to elect people like that make no positive or constructive contribution to these coalition negotiations. In fact, all they do is destabilize them, because it's basically just checkbook politics. You can always get a higher price from the ANC or from some other partner who's prepared to collapse the whole thing to start negotiations again on the basis of who gets what.
So you're saying voting for those smaller parties is a waste of a vote?
Yeah, it links to the earlier discussion from Dr. Chikani, the point that, and I'm using his words, the Johnny Steinberg piece, that our electoral system allows these, what he calls the crazies. He allows the crazies to blossom. And we see that in Johannesburg, we see that in Ekurhuleni, in Tshwane, in Port Elizabeth. I see them in my own council. Fortunately, don't have to rely on them to get budgets passed and so on, because that would be a particular nightmare.
Lindiwe, how can the public make coalitions work and hold politicians accountable?
Yeah.
Recalcitrant ones, even.
Yeah, I mean, I have to disagree with Jordan. I think that political maturity is not a function of size. There are immature big parties, there are immature small parties. And I don't think we can characterize them across the board just on the basis of their size. They may have a different way of exercising their interest because of their size. And perhaps for those that fall in the very small minority, actually, of being big enough to be able to form part of a coalition and small enough to do so in a way that can also make it fall, yes, I'm sure there is a perverse disincentive to see themselves as kingmakers. That I totally understand. But we've also seen the evil that comes from too much size. There is evil from size, there's evil from being small, the evil comes from all permutations. It all boils down to the character of the leaders and the systems and processes that the political parties have internally to vet candidates for quality and integrity, to prevent shenanigans during selection processes, and to present to the voters a decent slate of non-criminals for election into office, right?
Non-criminals.
These are... These shenanigans can happen in any party size, and there's the arrogance of being a big party, there's also the cynicism of being a political party that's small but can also act as a kingmaker, and I just think that exists across the board. I have a view that as South Africans, we have yet to reform our idea of what it means to be citizens. We are trapped in this paradigm whereby government gives us services and we define our citizenship based on what we're entitled to. We deserve education, we deserve, and these are not untruths, but we deserve to get education, we deserve service delivery, we deserve a social safety net, we deserve the eradication of crime. These are all things that need to be delivered to us. But we have not yet framed a conception of what it means for us to participate in that giving. What does it take for us to make sure we get those things? What is expected of us? What participation must we compel ourselves to engage in as citizens in order to ensure that governments deliver on their outcomes? How do we frame a citizenship that isn't about voting every 5 years and then being critics, restaurant critics and movie critics who sit on the sidelines and go, that's terrible, that's hilarious, oh my God, what's happening there? This is our country, right? So how can you oversee your local government? Join your local ward committee. You have ward committees where decisions about budgeting are made and citizens are supposed to be members of those committees. At the moment, there's a few people, interest groups who get involved, political parties send their memberships, but ordinary citizens are absent. And again, we don't have a civic education program in schools and universities in this country. So in large part, this information is like a black box, how much participatory space there is. You can participate in your city's IDP process. You can participate in your community policing forum. You can form part of budgetary oversight, all kinds of decision-making in your community. Once you make the decision that this is your city, your country, and you have a role to play in making it work. Not that your job is to vote every 5 years, the least worst option out there, and then kind of sit back and wait to see what actually happens. I think that's the solution to the question that you're asking. And look, people feel helpless until they know what these mechanisms are, until the information is widely available, circulating in a healthy way. People are going to struggle to figure out how to make this work. So interest groups form, donors come together, they want to figure out how they can keep the traffic lights on, etc. There are these kind of sort of, diffuse initiatives taking place. But we have statutory bodies in this country that are convened by law and policy that require citizen engagement in policy and decision making. And we need to make sure we're part of those decisions.
Josefeso, you have the last say before we move on to audience questions and answers.
I mean, my answer is going to depress everyone because I kind of disagree with what was just said. So I've been shouting this to whoever is willing to listen to me. There isn't a single public participation mechanism in this country that puts the fear of God in a politician. It's humans are rational actors. When we don't participate in something, it's not just because we don't know enough. It is because we are seeing that it doesn't change anything. The greatest example of this was the deputy president organized a group of political parties and a few different actors to come together in Cape Town last June to talk about how do we do this coalition thing. The entire conversation was, we need to, either it's a threshold or not a threshold of this, so that we can determine what we do at a local level. And I put up my hand and I said, but who are you to determine what you do at a local level? Because that's what the IDP is for. Why on earth are you putting us through the entire exercise of creating an IDP if you're just going to determine what's going to happen at a local level? Then don't invite us to that meeting. I haven't spoken to a demographic like this in a very, very long time, so I might be gambling here, but how many people in this room have participated in an IDP process? Raise your hand. How many people who participated felt as if their views were put inside that IDP?
Sure.
You've got the mayor.
Right?
The only one.
That's a fundamental problem. Whether it is given, I've given so many public comments to Parliament, so many, all of them ignored, because there's no consequence for it. I've attended public meetings. If a politician is here to govern out of the benevolence of their heart, nothing will change. That's the problem that we have with coalitions right now. It comes back to the winner takes all. Who gets to determine who gets to win, who gets to lead the path, right? That logic is not informed by my mandate is coming from these individuals who have voted from me. Because if I don't listen to them, I am out of power. There's a disconnect in our politics. And as soon as we become a lot more real about that conversation, the sooner we can then have a conversation about what real accountability looks like in this country. Without that, all coalitions will be a mess outside of small little locales who must do their coalitions well, right? But in the big metros, it's just going to be chaos.
Okay. Thanks. So we're running out of time, and we've got a lot of questions, so we're just going to have a few. And I did want to have a rapid fire asking you your predictions. So if we can fit that in the last 2 minutes, Ray. The one question is from Ruan Filyun. Should rules and legislation around votes of no confidence not be changed to ensure coalition stability? I think we've touched on it, but who would like to answer?
I think Sorry, I think the only rule that needs changing is how long we have to form governments. I think the period after the election is too short.
14 days at the
It's
moment.
much too short. It presumes
Wait.
again that there's going to be a majority party.
Is that consensus
But
there?
I mean, this is absolutely critical. We are going to have a coalition negotiation after the 29th of May.
Yeah,
How are we going to get that done in 14 days? It's not actually
madness.
possible.
Yeah.
So not enough people are talking about what happens. I'm not even sure. Do we go to Parliament or to the Concourt and ask for some kind of extension? I
we
don't
have
know if they're
another
allowed to do
election?
that. This is a really important question. There's not a, I don't know, Professor, you must tell us comparatively if there's another government in the world that has been negotiated in 14 days.
Yeah. I mean, it's impossible to do it in 14 days. I mean, one of the recommendations that we actually came out for a legal framework, and unfortunately, I mean, government came too late to us to put it together only on the 28th of February. It's a very last minute thing. But I think it's going to be very important that we at least extend the 14 days to at least 30 days. I mean, that is sort of the norm elsewhere. But it's also going to be quite important that what we also need to do, I mean, part of the culture why coalitions fail is also the public service, because we don't have a professional public service. And it means that, so even if when a government fails, a coalition government fails, it just means that delivery also fails. So two things that we may need to do is, obviously the most important thing is we need to professionalize the public service. We need to get competence there. But the second thing that we need to do from a negotiating point of view, we'll have to give the senior public servants power during the period of negotiation so that government continues, budgets are rolled out, delivery happens. It's going to be very important.
So the question was centered around regulating motions of no confidence, but generally, should we regulate, put laws into place? William, I want to stick with you. Put regulations and laws into place to police or regulate how adults should behave, I guess, in coalitions. Is putting in new regulations, laws, the right approach, the wrong approach?
You know, Dave, I mean, obviously difficult to regulate people to become mature. No, we can actually, we can do that. I mean, there's some proposal. I mean, there's one proposal that where it wants to reduce votes of no confidence. So we say, can we restrict it to constructive votes of no confidence? Because, you know, we cannot ban votes of no confidence because that would be also undemocratic and unconstitutional. But how do we find a middle way where we allow for constructive votes of confidence? Obviously, the difficulty is what is a constructive vote of no confidence?
Who decides?
Seems like it all boils down to having good leadership, ethical, capable, responsive
a combination of good leadership and good systems. Yeah. Anyway, Doc, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, sorry. I don't like the argument of like we just need good leaders. I'm just like, our political system should not be dependent on whether someone is a good leader. You could be a horrible leader who's representative of individuals in the country and the system should still function.
Yeah.
That should be the marker of democracy.
Yeah.
Right? That really should be the marker. This thing of looking for someone to be a great leader, a savior, a big person to come and take us out of the doldrums, like we really need to get out of that as quick as possible. I don't know what the regulations could look like. I mean, I can spit out different things as individuals. It really does come down to, even if we want to change the regulations, and what's the phrase? Listen to me carefully now. If the people who have to change the regulations, their self-interest don't align with changing those regulations, nothing will change. We're running into a crisis where the type of electoral reform that is required in our country requires political parties to work against their self-interest. The 100% PR system is fundamentally beneficial to the current status quo of political parties. They've got no incentive to change it, yet we've left it in their hands to make that change. It's a crazy situation. And again, it comes back to, and even if we wanted to force them to think differently, there's no mechanism that we have at our disposal. So we could talk about regulations as much as we want. We could throw ideas at them. If they don't want to do it, they won't. That's the question we need to be having going forward over this next election. And as my quick prediction, I don't think the ANC is going to lose, guys. Don't get too excited. Right? It's a monumental fall to go up from 57 to under 50. It is, no party is dropped like that. And then where do the votes come from? Brent Hurst came out saying DA will go from 20 to 27. 7% would be a groundbreaking electoral gain that no one has seen since 1994 of an established party. The ANC will not lose. I will stand by this. I'll eat my hat. 2029 is our fight. And the question is, what are the types of regulations and rules that we want to put into place for that 2029 fight?
So I want to say, we can easily fall into this like nihilistic pattern where we think that we need to find one silver bullet.
Just
right?
one.
We need electoral reform, or we need to change the regulations, or we need great leaders, or we need public participation. We need all these things.
Yeah.
If we can fire our MPs and we couple that with public participation, they'll be scared, right?
Lindiwe, could we, because we're running out of time, I would like, you touched on it, can you give in this conversation, can you just give what your prediction is? Bearing in mind coalitions, it's rapid fire, putting you on the spot, what is your prediction, Lindiwe, and then we could just take it through.
I hate these.
And I think because we have the representative from Cape Town, we need to do Western Cape as well, because there's not guaranteed of a majority with the National and Western Cape. So if you could just do National and Western Cape.
Quickly.
Me?
Rapid fire. You?
Well, everything's not about the Western Cape. I'm going to do Gauteng.
There we go.
So,
Where's that?
I don't see the ANC falling far below 50%. I think it can fall below 50% under the right circumstances. I don't know that it's going to hit 45 or 43, which means it's going to pick the smallest party that's big enough to be in a coalition government with it, that is going to give it stability, continuity, and not too much trouble, right? And those parties look something like Freedom Front, IFP, parties the ANC's already governed before with through invitational government, right? So that's my view on national. On provinces, I think Gauteng is very exciting, and I think there's a prospect. There's only, in my view, there's one good thing that's going to come out of this MPC, is that the guys are talking. You know, they preceded the 14 days. They're already talking. So there's an opportunity for them to think about what a permutation of a new provincial government in Gauteng and possibly even in KZN looks like. But it's not a national conversation. I'm excited about Gauteng. I think Action SA is going to do very well, and I think it could tip the opposition over 50% and give them a chance to govern. I don't live here anymore, so I'm going to let Jordan talk about the Western Cape.
Jordan, very quickly, and William will be in trouble. Very quickly, your predictions, please. Eh?
William first.
Jordan?
Growing up as a young political organizer, the only question was, is the ANC going to get a 2/3 majority? That era is over. I firmly believe the ANC's support is in free fall, and they are going to lose their majority on the 29th of May, 2024. And it is going to be epoch-changing for South Africa. I don't know if it's going to be 40 or 47 or 48. That kind of crystal balling in politics is very dangerous.
William, you have the last word. I have to cut you off. I'm sorry.
And we're going to
very quickly, William.
I think the ANC is going to fall under 50%. A couple of provinces are going to be run now by the opposition parties, potentially KwaZulu-Natal, Gauteng, even the Free State. I think the ANC in the Eastern Cape is going to get to that floor of 50%. And I actually think it is up to the opposition. They can actually take the ANC below 40%. And I know we talked about 50%. I'm beginning to think there is a possibility. Obviously, they have to have an exciting campaign, they have to have a positive campaign, and they can't have a campaign the same ways they've run in the past. It has to be totally different.
I hope you're empowered with information. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.